Football show. It's week 11, and we're taking a look at the quarterbacks and tight ends to stash for the fantasy playoffs. We got our special guest, Jeff Bell, joining us from the Footballguys Dynasty Show. Make sure you are subscribed to that channel because Jeff and Jagger are bringing you guys awesome Dynasty content every single week. And we're getting into the Dynasty season where you're going to be making a whole bunch of trades, starting to look at the rookie drafts that are coming up. So make sure you're subscribed there. And today, with the quarterbacks and tight ends to stash for fantasy playoffs, I know it's a little early. It's week 11, but for a lot of leagues, it is the standard trade deadline week for a lot of people. I know specifically for sleeper leagues, Dave, right? I opened up the app and there we are, trade deadline, and you've declined all my trades.
That is not true. I got Taysom Hill from you in a Dynasty League just last week, and Jeff Bell and I made a trade last week as well. This is the year that, like, I feel like when I have played fantasy football for so long, like I always wanted to make sure I was like winning every single deal and trying to squeeze every little bit of value out of every single deal. I am so quick this year. Maybe it's just because I'm just so like dissociated from having any sorts of feelings of connection with these players on my team because I'm in so many leagues. But like if I'm ready to move off of a player and I get a fair deal or an offer for said player, I'll accept it. I've made more trades this season than I have ever made in fantasy football before.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes people struggle to understand winning a trade or trade value because they just look at that date and time, but they can go either direction. The player that you trade away could get injured and you have a massive win, or the player that you trade for could get hurt and you have a massive win, or value shift. You're trading at this point in time, but you're projecting to the future, and that can go either way. Wins can become losses, and losses can become wins.
All right, Scott.
Well, I was about to say,
right into the whiskey hour. And I mean, in a league that I'm in just 2 weeks ago, we saw a trade go down. Somebody gave up Javonte Williams for George Pickens. And at the time, everybody was ripping the guy who got George Pickens, saying like, what are you doing? Like, this guy's a wide receiver 3, and in return, you're giving away an RB1, and everybody was ripping on him. It took 2 weeks for that to be like, Javonte Williams is droppable now, and George Pickens is a top 5 tight end going into week 11, or wide receiver going into week 11. So things change quickly. Just, if you're ready to make a trade, make a trade. They're fun. It's a good way to spice up your leagues.
So now that we got the trade juices flowing,
3 minute talk about trades, and now we're not going to talk about trades at all.
No, lies. We are.
Some of these are trades. Yeah,
trades because since we are in trade deadline week, some of these players we are going to talk about today are players that you can acquire via trade, specifically at the tight end spot. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the show. But let's start off with quarterbacks, because all 3 of the quarterbacks that we're talking about stashing here should be available on the waiver wire in your league. So, Jeff, why don't you kick us off with the quarterback that you want to stash for the fantasy playoffs?
Aaron Rodgers is my stash for the fantasy playoffs. And I think that, I've seen him shake free. He's on some waivers, and even especially shallower leagues can even be on waivers. And I think when you looked at the playoff schedule ahead, really, I want to look for motivation when I'm looking for a playoff potential stash. And I'm seeing, we have the Denver Broncos at 5-5, sitting in the 7th spot in the playoffs. And I see 3 teams behind them: the Cincinnati Bengals, the Miami Dolphins, and the New York Jets. All 3 came into this year with exponentially high playoff expectations. I think all 3 have the personnel to be able to finish strong. And I do expect some of them to finish strong, if not all 3 to finish strong. And coming on a stash, I can't really say go stash Joe Burrow because he's a consensus top 6 quarterback. So that doesn't really work. And doing the show with Alfredo, I don't really want to say nice things about the Dolphins. So I'm going to leave Tua Tagovailoa off of that. So that's where we default to Aaron Rodgers.
I don't want to catch any strays. Let's just not talk about the Bears on this show. Let's just make a
believe me, we're talking about
effort not to talk about
the Bears are not going to be mentioned, so no, we don't have to worry about that. The only teams that score touchdowns, Dave. But when you look at Rodgers, he's been quarterback 13 in total points, 19 in points per game since week 2 to 9. He had his worst game of the season in week 10. Closes well, has the Jaguars, has the Rams, and then has a Buffalo team that frankly might not be playing for a whole lot in week 17. So you like that playoff schedule, and at some point with Davante Adams here, with Garrett Wilson here, with Breece Hall here, you would have to believe the Jets are going to click at some point, maybe.
I like a lot of confidence at the end. They have to click at some point, maybe. It's a really strong way to start it out, but I think
it can't get any worse, right?
Famous last words. Yeah, I think we all kind of had these crazy high expectations for Aaron Rodgers and the Jets going into the season, and it feels like this weird fever dream where every week you're like, did they really play that bad? Like there's no way you're looking at this roster and it's really just not working out for them. Breece Hall, all these guys that were actually at times looking like they were going to be top 5 at their position. It's not looking great. Dave, speaking of guys who are not top 5 at their position, why don't you hit us with your quarterback stash here? Because this is a fun surprise. This is a guy we talked about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, Bryce Young is starting to look a little bit better. And again, if you really want to make that playoff push, go out and trade for a Lamar Jackson, a Jalen Hurts, a Josh Allen, one of these guys, Jaden Daniels, like a true difference maker. But we're trying to talk about some guys that you might be able to pick up if you're streaming quarterbacks or you're really hurt at the position. And Bryce Young has quietly looked good over the last couple of weeks. The production hasn't really been there, but I was looking through PFF. Sometimes I'll defer to them to see if what they're saying matches what my eyes are telling me. And 2 of his top 4 passing grades throughout his entire career have come over the last 2 weeks. He's playing much better football. Now, of course, they're going into the bye this week, and that could either help him study up and come out of the bye even better, or he can do what happened in Chicago, and they come out of the bye looking totally flat and lose all motivation and momentum. We'll see how that goes. But if you look at Bryce Young's stretch through the playoffs, he's got a pretty nice matchup here. Week 15, he plays against Dallas, which is the second best matchup among quarterbacks, according to the Footballguys strength of schedule tool. Week 16, he doesn't have an ideal matchup. He's going up against Arizona, which is a negative matchup for quarterbacks. But then week 17, he gets to face off against Tampa Bay, giving you the third best quarterback matchup. So in that playoff run, weeks 15, 16, and 17, he has 2 of the top 3 matchups that quarterbacks can face against, going against Dallas and Tampa Bay. So I know this is mostly in your deeper leagues. I'm talking 14 plus leagues. If you're looking for somebody to stream, he's probably not available in your 2 quarterback and super flex leagues, but he's a guy that you could probably trade for pretty cheap in those leagues and help set you up for a nice little playoff run. Now, Arizona in week 16, like I said, is that one bad matchup that I'm a little bit concerned about. So if I am going this Bryce Young route, some other guys that I'd be looking at to maybe add as well. Russell Wilson in week 16 plays against Baltimore, which is a good matchup. Jameis Winston plays against Cincinnati, which is a good matchup as well. There's a few ways this can go coming out of the bye, but we haven't seen a ton of Bryce Young yet. Rookie season, kind of just chalking that up as the Panthers being in disarray. And then in year 2, we had the back and forth with Andy Dalton, but seems like we're starting to see some of the potential for Bryce Young now, and I'm willing to buy in if I can pick him up for free off waivers.
Jeff, how much of the intangible part of being a fantasy manager plays into this, where in theory, like the meme with Jurassic Park, like in theory, it should work that you pick up Bryce Young and he's got the good schedule and he's playing better. How much of that intangible part, like in the back of your head, just says you can't start Bryce Young in the fantasy playoffs? You're gonna torpedo your only chances. But how do you balance that out?
I really look at it when we're talking about stashes and you're talking about setting your roster up. I'm not thinking that I'm going to start Bryce Young over Jalen Hurts, but I am potentially setting myself up that if Jalen Hurts were to miss a week and I need to go to something, I've got that in the back of my pocket. And I think that that's when you got to kind of flip what you're looking at. You're not looking at potential replacements for the player that's got you to the playoffs, because especially this year, a lot of the teams, you're going to have your Lamar Jackson, your Jalen Hurts in your fantasy playoffs. You're looking for, if everything goes wrong and I'm going to be looking at a waiver wire that has Cooper Rush and Mac Jones as potentials for me to play in my playoff matchup, how can I insulate against that now? Is that avenue available?
And I think that's it. Yeah, you're setting yourself up if you need, an injury fill-in or something like that. Or like I said, in your 2 quarterback and super flex leagues, I don't think it's crazy that, a couple of weeks from now, if they come out of the bye and they still look good, I don't think it's crazy that we're going to be looking at Bryce Young as a potential top 24 quarterback going into weeks 15, 16, and 17, where you're happy to plug him in as your QB2.
I think it's valuable to realize by that point we would have another month of information. So if you would have another month of, if Bryce Young continues this trend for another month, then you're going to start to feel a whole lot better about him than you do at this point in time.
Who knows? Maybe Jalen Coker can become a thing between now and then.
Maybe the Panthers can become a thing between now and then. Who knows?
Jonathan Brooks, who knows what he can add to this offense?
Let's not get crazy.
Wheels up for the Panthers.
Let's not get crazy, David. Let's not get crazy yet. But Jeff, I think you nailed it there. I think that I do want people to understand from this show, and when we're talking about stashing these players, it's not because you are going to pick them up and start them over the guys that got you there. You continue to ride on the horse that you came into town with, but if something were to happen to one of them, or if you're streaming, right? And you're picking up a bunch of different guys. Maybe you've got some sort of combo of like a Bo Nix and a Bryce Young, and you're going through that. That's where things change a little bit. So the context is important here. I'm going to give you my quarterback that I want to pick up off waivers because he's available in 70% of leagues on Sleeper, 78% of leagues on Yahoo. I'm talking about Russell Wilson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And we're recording this on Wednesday morning. And there's a good chance that Russell Wilson was actually picked up off your waiver wire this week. And hopefully you were the guy that did it. But he's still available in so many leagues. And if he was not picked up in your league, I'd go ahead and consider stashing him somewhere on your bench, because not only have the Steelers looked good, but it's kind of looked a little bit like vintage Russ, and he looks a lot more comfortable. He looks like he's having fun again. You say what you want about him being just a kind of a straight up algorithm. The algorithm's hitting right now, and it's working, and the play looks night and day from what we were seeing in Denver last season. And going forward for the Pittsburgh Steelers at the quarterback spot, they're going to have the fourth easiest remaining strength of schedule for the rest of season. Something that kind of gets overlooked sometimes with these is no bye weeks. So you're not picking up a guy to then have to bench him or potentially even drop him when you run into a bye week problem later. And then for the actual fantasy playoffs themselves, third easiest strength of schedule within that week 15 to 17 time frame. So you've got a guy who's not only going to have a great fantasy playoff schedule, but a pretty good rest of season schedule. And when I look at the fantasy playoffs in particular, it's Philly, it's Baltimore, and it's Kansas City. Teams that all three of them together allowing an average of 18 fantasy points per game. And these are also going to be matchups that are going to be shootout opponents. These are going to be teams where Pittsburgh's going to have to keep up with them in terms of offense. All three of these teams are pretty good at stopping the run, but not so great at stopping the pass. And
one more time, who did you say that? You said Baltimore, Kansas City, and Cincinnati?
Philly, Baltimore, and Kansas City.
Philly, Baltimore. All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Tough. I mean, shootout potential for sure, but that is...
Oh, it's rough. A tough schedule.
If the Steelers are pushing for a playoff spot, that's a tough spot to be in to finish the year.
Yeah, they might lose all three games, but that doesn't mean that we don't get some fantasy production from Russ, who's going to have to really put it all out there. And since he's become the starter for the Steelers, he's averaging over 19 fantasy points per game. So I think a lot of that's going to continue to hold true as he goes through this easy fantasy schedule. And he's been this one actually hit me 7th in fantasy points per game, ahead of Jaden Daniels, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love. It's wild, but Russ is cooking, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the offenses look good. Go ahead, Jeff.
This week will be an interesting matchup going up against Baltimore, and I don't know whether or not Kyle Hamilton will be available for that, but we've seen Baltimore absolutely shredded in the past game, and that's the way you're going to attack them. And another underrated aspect is we saw Mike Williams come through with that game-winning touchdown last week, and he wasn't very involved, but he did catch the game-winning touchdown, and Mike Williams gives you, if you're going to get close to high-level Mike Williams, that gives you so much more than Van Jefferson running in that wide receiver 2 spot, opening up those deep balls from Russ, which we know is a big part of his game. We've seen Calvin Austin step up as a playmaker occasionally, and so you've got Pickens and Williams on the outside catching those moon balls from Russ. You've got a strong run game. Everything is in place here for this production to continue.
Yeah, give me one reason that they shouldn't just be running go routes with Mike Williams on one side and George Pickens on the other on every single play. Like, just give them an opportunity to go up and make plays. We know the run game is there. I'm with it with Russ. I think of all of the players we've discussed, he's probably my favorite because he's the one that you can actually reasonably envision in your starting lineup for the next few weeks. Like, Bryce Young, some things need to happen. Aaron Rodgers, we need the tides to turn a little bit in New York. If you pick up Russell Wilson, you play him this week, you play him next week, you can ride him all the way through the rest of the playoffs. What we're doing in this show, so much of this is in the context of schedule. First and foremost, you want to pick the best players. But if you're in a position where all the best players are gone and you're kind of scraping the barrel to pick somebody up that you can put into your lineup, these guys mostly have favorable matchups. And just want to shout that out, Alfredo. You can find it on our website, footballguys.com. We have our strength of schedule tool. Today we're talking about quarterbacks and tight ends, but we do this for every single position, breaks it down by week, gives you the average over the rest of the season. And you can kind of, if you're in a position where you've already got a 99% chance of making the playoffs, you've already locked in the playoff spot, whatever it may be, now is when you start kind of mapping out your path to a championship.
Yeah, and another tool that we have on the site, since we're just shouting out tools, because Football Guys does have some fantastic tools, is the Fantasy Points Allowed tool, where you are able to really just kind of parse through those matchups and not just look at strength of schedule and blindly follow that, but you can actually go in and take a look at the context as to, because like there's times where I'm saying, okay, well, Miami's been really good against quarterbacks. What's that about? And then you look at all the quarterbacks they face and you're like, oh, got it. Okay. They get shredded when they play actual good quarterbacks. Okay. Makes sense. So it's cool to kind of open that up and go through that. All right, guys. So those are our 3 quarterbacks that we want to stash for the fantasy playoffs. Now we're going to look at tight end. And this has been a position that's been, I think, more frustrating than any position this year in fantasy football, because this was supposed to be the tight end renaissance. Everyone was saying tight end is back and you can go ahead and draft early tight ends. You can just draft all the tight ends and you'll be fine. And more than ever this year, it just doesn't seem like it really matters. And well, now there's some names that are starting to get hot late in the season. So Jeff, why don't you kick us off with your tight end to stash for the fantasy playoffs?
Yeah, so context on this one is important. And we talked about these stashes looking for potential situations. Week 17, the Carolina Panthers, as Dave mentioned, play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have been one of the worst pass defenses in the NFL and allowed the most points to tight ends. If you remove the Chiefs had a tough run to start the year. If you take that out, then the Buccaneers have allowed the most points to the tight end position this year. They have the Panthers in week 17. Ja'Tavion Sanders has kind of stepped up and started to emerge. And you look back over his last 5 games, there was one game where Tommy Tremble came back, was knocked out for concussion for 2 games, came back one game, injured his back in that game and was out again. In that game, Sanders took a back seat to Tremble, and maybe Tremble comes back healthy, and this is just a complete punt. But if you remove that game, he's been tight end 13 over the last 5 weeks, or just those 4 weeks in the last 5. And so that gives you that your matchup in week 17. And that's what we're really looking for, is potential stash to go there. And you're going to have, again, another month of information, another month potential of emergence for Ja'Tavion Sanders. And that is, I think that puts you in a place where if this production continues, you're going to look at that matchup in week 17. And if you are streaming, if you lose a tight end, something like that, that could be the type of play that can push you over the top and win your league.
You heard it here. Bryce Young and Ja'Tavion Sanders, the stack you need to win your fantasy football league.
This is either going to be a really smart show or a really stupid show in about 7 weeks.
No, Ja'Tavion Sanders is look good, though.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Ja'Tavion Sanders, we knew he was a great athlete. He was kind of buried at University of Texas last year, playing on the same team with Adonai Mitchell and with Xavier Worthy, but we knew the athleticism was there, and it's quickly starting to translate to the NFL. So I'm with you, Jeff. I mean, we talk about this all the time. Like, if you want a tight end in fantasy, a young tight end in fantasy, you want a guy with off-the-charts athleticism, and and Sanders has that, and he's getting more involved now. There was some concern about how Ian Thomas and Tommy Tremble and these other guys would kind of work in this tight end committee, but Ja'Tavion Sanders is running away with the job right now. Again, a deep league play for sure. But we asked the dynasty captain on the show, so we're going to get some deep rookies here, but especially in dynasty leagues, I'm going out and I'm actively trying to trade for Ja'Tavion Sanders if I can, because we've seen the flashes, and I think the ceiling for him is so high.
Yeah, David, I mean, speaking of all things we talk about, is like, this is one of those things that sort of transcends from dynasty to redraft, where this is the time of year we're looking at the younger players, whether it's the second year breakouts or the rookies that are just getting up to speed. This is the time to start to look at them, because the guy who's maybe given you nothing through the first 8 to 10 to 12 weeks, all of a sudden catches fire in week 14, week 13. And you're saying, who's that guy? Like, why has that not been a waiver wire pickup? Why has that not been a player that we're drafting? And we kind of talked about that a little bit with Ricky Pearsall, where I think everything's getting warm right now, and he could be one of those guys that ends up being really important in the fantasy playoffs. But Ja'Tavion Sanders, I like this. This is a deep cut. And for those of you who probably can't make a trade for a tight end, I think Sanders becomes a nice stash at the end of the bench at the tight end spot.
We do talk all the time about exercising patience with rookies and waiting for them to heat up. I just want to throw it out there. One guy that I'm done waiting on is Xavier Worthy. I've cut him in so many redraft leagues. I don't know how you guys feel about it. We always say, like, you don't want to cut these rookies, especially your first round rookies. Since DeAndre Hopkins has shown up, I mean, yeah, there've been some near misses. And I know we're talking about like stashes on the show and quarterbacks and tight ends, and here I am talking about a wide receiver to drop. But are you guys just totally out on Xavier Worthy too? I mean, maybe he could figure it out like next year, but for the rest of this year, he's one of those just sabotage drops. Like, I will drop him and let my league mates deal with the headache. Jeff?
Yeah, he's dealing with an injury right now, so we're watching that. And you talk about close misses. He had one on the sideline that he just missed. Both of actually the last 2 weeks.
Both games, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, they're not making a concentrated effort to involve him. They're occasionally getting him a shot play, and they've not been able to connect on those. So, yes, don't feel like right now you can start Xavier Worthy in your lineup. And I feel like this is a little bit of sabotage because Dave and I did a trade a little while back and he got one of his favorites and Ricky Pearsall straight up for Xavier Worthy. I had Patrick
Forgot about
Mahomes
that one.
and Travis
Yeah.
Kelce and DeAndre Hopkins. So I just went heavy onto the Chiefs stack and added Xavier Worthy. And so Dave, I think, is setting me up here. But no, I think
I forgot we made that trade. That was a few weeks ago. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that one. But yeah,
It
it
does
was
do
a
that.
few weeks ago that I just started looking. I was watching Xavier Worthy, and I'm like, I don't think this is going to work out. And I just started trying to trade away all my Xavier Worthy shares. In the few leagues I couldn't trade him away, shallower leagues I just flat out dropped him. What a fun show we're having about quarterbacks and tight ends to stash for your playoffs and go on a 5-minute tangent about Xavier Worthy.
You did this. You're definitely the hot dog suit guy. Like, we got to get the guy who did this.
I'll take full blame
it's
for
when
that
I
one.
show up. Dave goes off the rails when I show up. It happened.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dave, now it's your turn to talk again. So give us your tight end that you want to stash or even trade for the
This
fantasy
is
players.
this is definitely more of a trade target. I don't think TJ Hockenson is available in any leagues right now. You look at rest of season rankings, most have him in the 8 to 10 range, but he's a guy right now that if I can go out and trade for him, I'm absolutely trying to. If I've got a Kyle Pitts or a K. Dotton or a David Njoku, something like that, I'd be willing to throw a little bit extra on top to move up to TJ Hockenson, even though consensus rankings have TJ Hockenson behind. You look, he's got the 4th best remaining schedule for tight end over the rest of the season, but inside the fantasy playoffs, every matchup he has is top 10 for tight ends. And again, using the Football Guys strength of schedules tool here, Week 15 against Chicago, that's the 8th best matchup. Week 16 against Seattle, that's the 7th best matchup. And then Week 17 against Green Bay, that is the 5th best matchup. Now, like I said, you can't get him off of waivers. You're going out and trading for this guy, but I prefer Hockenson over so many guys that are ranked ahead of him in consensus rankings right now. You look last week, I mean, he hasn't played more than 50% of the snaps in either of the games since he's returned from this ACL injury. Last week, on less than 50% of the snaps, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 72 yards. Those are the stat lines that we saw consistently last year. TJ Hockenson isn't a game breaker like he was in Detroit, where he'd have these huge games and the big breakaway runs. He kind of works in this Kevin O'Connell offense as the underneath safety valve. If Justin Jefferson isn't open downfield, they are just going to immediately avert their attention to TJ Hockenson, throw it to him in the flat. He's going to pick up 6 yards, not generate anything after the catch, and just kind of fall over. But that's a great role for fantasy, especially in PPR. Like, this guy is going to get peppered with targets. He's going to rack up yards. And right now, I think it might be hard to get him after the outing that he had last week, but like I said, I'm okay trading away guys like K. Dotton and David Njoku and Kyle Pitts and other hot names right now to get TJ Hockenson for that playoff push.
Well, I think it's still early enough in the TJ Hockenson warm up that you can go and make those deals and not pay full price just yet. I think you're going to have enough people that are getting a little panicky about Sam Darnold, and maybe rightfully so, because he hasn't looked awesome the past couple weeks. But like you said, Dave, TJ Hockenson is going to be one of those guys that's just going to continue to take the brunt of the targets in this offense. Well, I mean, Justin Jefferson, of course, but TJ Hockenson becomes sort of the 1B in this offense. And like you pointed out, even on limited snaps, 9 targets is nuts. Tight end 6 and half PPR last week. So you're pretty much getting a guy who's going to be top 6 every single week, we assume.
So I threw a few names out there, but like let me throw some other ones. Like a guy like Evan Ingram. Like, how big do you think the gap is between Evan Ingram and TJ Hockenson? Because rest of season tight end rankings would prefer Evan Ingram. I prefer TJ Hockenson ahead of Evan Ingram. So like, I don't think you can trade your Evan Ingram to get TJ Hockenson in return. But what do you try to do in a situation like that? Do you try to add like the TJ Hockenson manager if he's got, Joe Mixon? Do you think adding a guy like Dameon Pierce, like allowing that guy to like handcuff his running back, is enough to make that difference? Or because I want to go out and trade for TJ Hockenson, but usually with these 1Z positions, quarterbacks and tight ends, the trade market is just so dead that it's hard to get deals done.
It is hard to get deals done, and that is a potential avenue. I think that you can make the argument, especially tight end premium scoring leagues, you might want to favor Evan Ingram, because I think the only thing that works with Mac Jones at quarterback is short passes to Evan Ingram. But I do put them right there.
I saw that the tight end target share was like 60% for the Jaguars last week. Not just Evan Ingram, like Evan Ingram, Brenton Strange, like that is all Mac Jones did was throw 2 tight ends.
I want to mention Josh Oliver. If you look at the top 15 tight end scorers over the last 3 weeks, it's 14 names that you would expect it to be. Even if you look at the top 10 scores, it's 9 names you would expect it to be. Josh Oliver sitting there, and he's been the leading snapper for the tight ends for the Vikings over that period. It looks like he really took that job from I'm blanking on his first name, Johnny Munt.
Johnny Munt.
And yes, and Oliver's a plus blocker, but he's at the same time, if you watch the games, he's making some very athletic catches and some very surprising catches. 27 years old, that is kind of the prime for tight ends. And so I'm curious to see how this plays out. I'm not saying that I would not favor Josh Oliver over TJ Hockenson. I'm just curious to see how this plays out and what that does, because he's definitely being involved.
Yeah, I think we're at a nice little sort of crossing point with this Vikings offense where you're either going to find people. I think so much of this is just going to be the conversation you have with that manager in your league. It's not going to be just the hardcore straight up analysis of what the numbers are telling you, because there's a lot of people. It's either you believe in the Vikings going forward and Kevin O'Connell and the offense and what they can do, even with a limited Sam Darnold, or you don't. Like, you simply don't, and you just want to abandon ship now. So, Dave, even though you mentioned that you don't think that someone would do an Evan Ingram for TJ Hockenson straight up, I think that in that conversation, you can kind of wedge that in there where, hey, Evan Ingram is the top target for the Jaguars. And you're not seeing a Parker Washington take off. You're not seeing any of these other guys like be very relevant. So I think it's all going to come down to the conversation you have with the manager in that league.
And I don't know if you guys can see me typing mid-show here, talking to my buddy Keith, who is an avid listener and viewer of the show. I know he'll be watching this later this afternoon. He's got George Kittle and TJ Hockenson on his team, and I'm trying to trade for one of them right now. I've got a few hours to get this deal done before the episode airs, because once he sees this, there's no way he's giving me TJ Hockenson.
All right, I'm going to give you guys my tight end. I guess I can't call him a stash. My tight end trade target here, and I'm going with David Njoku. And the reason I'm bringing him up is because I think he's going to be actually kind of attainable after the bye week that the Browns just had, and the early injuries in the season. It's a little bit kind of like this is the perfect storm where you can trade for a player, just like the TJ Hockenson thing that we were just talking about here, because the manager that has rostered David Njoku had to deal with injuries early on in the season, had to deal with a lot of missed weeks, a lot of half games played, and then a bye week now. They have had to pivot away from David Njoku so many times that there is a frustration that has probably set in, despite the multiple weeks where David Njoku has looked really good. So I think there's an opening here where you can make a trade for this player. And looking forward for the rest of the season here, David Njoku has the 7th easiest remaining strength of schedule and the 2nd easiest remaining strength of schedule in the fantasy playoffs. Once again, a player with no bye weeks because they just came off of theirs. So there's a lot of positive there in terms of just scheduling, but let's kind of dive deeper into that. The opponents, once again, it's another player that's got shootout opponents: Kansas City Chiefs, Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, maybe the Miami Dolphins. We'll see if they're actually, scoring points and doing that. But these teams are allowing an average of 14 fantasy points per game to the tight end spot. And David Njoku, in the games that he's finished so far, he's been around 11 fantasy points per game. So this is a guy where you're going to be seeing a positive value in terms of the fantasy playoff games. And actually that 11.1 fantasy points per game in the games that Njoku has finished would be tied with Brock Bowers for tight end 2 in half PPR. So there's just these little spurts where in those small sample sizes, Njoku has been really good. Now, the big thing is, can he remain healthy? And does Jameis Winston continue to give this Browns offense some life? Because I think it's very similar to the Vikings thing. Do you believe in Jameis? Do you believe that this offense can actually put up points despite all the struggles so far this season?
Yeah. Sorry, I was waiting for Jeff to pick up there, but Alfredo, it's always tough. You throw a third in there, and you never know. We're trying to bounce back and forth, but Alfredo, I just want to say I'm proud of you for accepting the gospel of David Njoku. I know it's been a long road to get here, but here you are, David Njoku, man. It looks fantastic.
I don't like
the biggest David Njoku hater this preseason.
No, I don't like when you do this.
Julia, pull up the film. We had so many debates on David Njoku.
Because I didn't like David Njoku with Deshaun Watson. And that's what I said over and over. See, I don't like this. I don't like this when you translate for me, David. You know what? No, 2 minutes penalty box.
I think
Jeff,
you just have a hesitancy to like anybody with the name David. I think that's what it is. David Njoku is a baller.
Definitely. There's a PTSD there. The D stands for David.
you see the addition of Jameis Winston brings in the verticality back to the Browns offense. And I think that as you get Nick Chubb up to speed, bringing the power run element, that opens up those pockets for David Njoku to attack up the seam in the middle of the field. And that's what you're hoping for. And so I think, certainly potential's there. We saw him close the second half of last year as the tight end one overall. Those big spike games are in play. That's really what, when you talk about stashes, that's really what you're talking about, setting yourself up for the opportunity, especially in these onesie positions, to grab one of those spike weeks when it matters most.
Yeah, I'm looking right now, and our rankings over at Football Guys still really like David Njoku. We've got him inside the top 5 going into this week. Again, it's so tough trading for quarterbacks and tight ends, which is why the show keeps getting off the rails, because we're talking about like how you're supposed to manufacture these trades. But who are some guys that you think you could realistically? The thing is, like, you probably can't do a tight end for tight end swap. Like, people are going to be very weary of any trade offer where it's like, hey, you want my Evan Ingram for your David Njoku? They're going to say, what does he know that I don't? So I think with these situations, to kind of put a bow on this conversation and how you want to try to address this, you're not going to be able to flip a quarterback for a quarterback typically, or a tight end for a tight end typically. So the best thing to do in these situations is hope that one of these guys that is rostering a Russell Wilson or a TJ Hockenson or a David Njoku has 2 quarterbacks or has 2 tight ends, and then you have a position of their need. This team needs an RB2 or needs a wide receiver 3, and you might be able to trade away a surplus of a position that you have to get one of these. That's really the only way I think you're going to be able to work this out, unless you're trying to tier up and add a handcuff or a wide receiver 4 or something like that. It's tough to get these deals done, but got a few days before the trade deadline to get creative here.
And I think that's why we mentioned Hockenson and Njoku, because they missed so much time earlier on in the season that these managers had to pivot and go elsewhere. So they likely are rostering 2 tight ends, especially with Njoku coming off this bye. Dave, you mentioned something that's really important in the context that I think all of the viewers and listeners need to have, is that you probably can't do position for position. That likely doesn't work out unless there's one of those things where someone says, yeah, I do like Evan Ingram more than TJ Hockenson. But what I want to do here is Yahoo Fantasy Football has some really interesting things where they show you trades that have actually happened in real leagues. And I want to see where you guys stand on this for let's just use David Njoku. Darnell Mooney for David Njoku.
I think I'd prefer Mooney. Yeah.
Okay.
Mooney's looking like a top 15 wide receiver. Like, it's been unbelievable what he's doing in Atlanta. I think I'd prefer Mooney.
Juwan Jennings for Njoku.
Njoku all day.
Okay.
That's got to be some weird scoring that we're not under. I don't know why anybody would give up. Jeff, do you have any insight as to why someone would do that?
Jennings played every snap for the 49ers last week, 11
targets. Oh, Juwan Jennings. I was thinking Juwan Johnson. Never mind. That's why I was like, why would somebody just
I think it's really interesting conversation and thought on this, because yes, you make a great point, because if you've got somebody in your league that has stashed that second tight end, or maybe they wanted to build bully tight end, or maybe something like that, and they're looking for how can they put more power into their lineup, and you've got a surplus somewhere else, that's a natural pivot point. That's a naturally, their mind is, okay, I've survived my tight ends bye. I would like to have another wide receiver here. I will move off of this player that I maybe ended up with, Tucker Kraft or something like that. And you really just kind of need that upgrade at tight end.
There's a fantasy
record, I prefer Juwan Jennings to David Njoku.
Okay.
I thought this was Juwan Johnson. I
know you're on your Ricky Pearsall, Dave, and so I was letting you go with it a little bit.
No. Definitely prefer Juwan Jennings to. I do not prefer Juwan Johnson to David Njoku. Let the record show.
All right. I think that what we're going to see, though, is that there are those people who went out and they got a Cade Otton, or Jeff, like you mentioned, a Tucker Kraft, and they feel comfortable at tight end, and they're saying, man, I really need a starting running back, or I really need that wide receiver 3 that I can flex every week. I will trade a David Njoku for another one on here, Ladd McConkey, or vice versa, So I think that that's going to be available for people. And I'm glad we were able to add some context to this, guys. And Jeff, thanks for joining us, man. It's fun. This was fun. Not a huge fan of recording this early, but it was fun.
This is great, though, because now, like, my work day's done at 8 a.m. I'm kidding. Okay. Still a lot of work to do, but done recording at 8 a.m., which is lovely.
Really hope Joe Bryant's not watching this one. All right. Well, we're going to be back again for, a full work day on Thursday with our week 11 starts and streamers. And then Friday, Dave and Jeff are going to be back on the audio side, going over the news and injury updates from the week. So make sure you're subscribed on Apple Podcast and Spotify as well. And then Sunday morning, you get to see Jeff one more time here on this channel with Joey Wright, Jagger May, Adam Hutchison, and a bunch of the other Football Guys staffers here for the Sunday morning live start sit show. And they're going to help you set your lineups there. As always, want to thank you guys for watching and listening all the way through. For myself, for Dave, for Jeff, we'll see you next time. Adios.